NIC started in the early 90s, at a time when senior housing was still a niche asset class, and operators were challenged to find capital sources willing to invest in senior housing with reasonable return expectations. The predecessor event to the first NIC conference was the Southeast Lenders Conference held in the spring of 1990. This event, organized by Bob Aramian and Al Holbrook, gathered lenders and senior housing operators from the Southeast in Atlanta, Georgia. The following spring, Mr. Aramian and Mr. Holbrook met with two other friends of theirs in the industry, Bob Kramer and Tony Mullen, in Washington, D.C. The four individuals first met through the National Association for Senior Living Industries, or NASLI, a trade association begun in 1985, for which Mr. Kramer had been the founding executive director and had led the organization for its first 2 years. Mr. Aramian and Mr. Holbrook had experience trying to arrange financing for senior housing properties and were well aware of the challenges facing developers and operators because of a lack of awareness about the sector by capital sources. Mr. Mullen had done market research on senior housing and saw the lack of any data or research on the fledgling sector as a barrier to attracting investor interest. When the four colleagues met in April of 1991, they discussed the need to have a broader conference on a national level that would seek to educate and connect not only debt sources, but also equity sources with senior housing operators. This led to the first NIC conference, held in Crystal City, Virginia, next door to Reagan National Airport, in October of 1991. Mr. Kramer, having previously organized other industry events, offered to put on the first conference. Organizers hoped for as many as 250 people and were pleasantly surprised when 436 attendees came to this first conference. The purpose of the conference was to facilitate capital formation by bringing together the C-suite of capital sources, both debt and equity, and operators to connect, educate, and discuss new ideas. Instead of having to fly around the country to build relationships and discuss ideas in person, key players in seniors housing and care could do so simply by attending NIC. After the success of the first conference, a number of organizations stepped forward, eager to make the NIC conference part of their organization. After nearly 18 months of discussion and debate, it was agreed that NIC needed to be independent from any industry trade organization in order to have greater credibility with investors it sought to attract, and in particular, in order to ensure the objectivity and trustworthiness of research and data it would seek to provide to the investment community. From the beginning, NIC was unique among industry organizations in fostering a discussion around the capital needs of the industry and seeking to educate sources of capital, both debt and equity. In 1993, NIC incorporated as a 501c3 not-for-profit organization with a board of directors. Mr. Aramian, Mr. Holbrook, and Mr. Mullen were all members of the original board, and the board contracted with Mr. Kramer and his company, Kramer & Associates, to produce the yearly conferences and run the small organization. Mr. Kramer was named the first executive director of NIC, which in the beginning was known as the National Investment Conference for the Seniors Housing and Care Industry, not the National Investment Center for Seniors Housing and Care, as it would go on to be called later. Mr. Mullen led efforts at NIC to encourage research and to produce peer-reviewed articles about aspects of the senior housing and care industry. Through Mr. Mullen's efforts, in 1994, the first annual Seniors Housing and Care Journal was published in a joint effort with Professor Michael Anakreef at Johns Hopkins University. In 1994, Mr. Kramer was invited by Jeff Dorman, founder and CEO of Institutional Real Estate, Inc., to address his advisory board of institutional investors, fund advisors, and managers at their annual board meeting in California. From discussions at that event with plan sponsors such as CalPERS and with fund managers, Mr. Kramer realized that in order to attract institutional capital to senior housing and care, the industry would have to produce data similar to that available to these investors for other commercial real estate property types and asset classes. Working together, Mr. Kramer and Mr. Mullen recruited a number of researchers who were known names and had done considerable work for institutional investors to do work on the first ever case for investing in seniors' housing and care properties in an institutional real estate portfolio. A team from Price Waterhouse wrote the initial study, which was published in 1997. And then Mr. Kramer hired a real estate consultant, often used by CalPERS, to write a separate paper offering his evaluation of the study. The investment case, as it came to be called, became the foundational document providing data and education for investors interested in this new property type. At this time, NIC also hired its first full-time research director, Harvey Singer. In 1998, NIC published the first of numerous studies conducted for the organization by ProMatura under the leadership of Dr. Margaret Weil. The first study was an in-depth analysis of residents in assisted living properties and, at the time, was the first major study on the assisted living property type. One finding of that study was that 2/3 of the residents of assisted living had incomes of $25,000 or less. This was so contrary to the understanding in the industry at that time that NIC commissioned a follow-up study titled An Income Confirmation Study of Assisted Living Residents. Released in 1999, this report verified the results of the previous study and also documented 2 other sources of revenue used by many residents in assisted living in addition to their income. 1, a slow but deliberate drawdown of assets, particularly home equity, and 2, payments made by adult children toward the monthly fees. In 1999, NIC launched the Key Financial Indicators, or KFIs, another step in giving investors transparency into key trends in the industry. As interest in the industry grew, NIC evolved to ensure efficiency of capital for seniors' housing and care. It was clear that more detailed data was necessary to compare senior housing returns to other real estate property types and to evaluate risks and opportunities within the sector. More detailed data required segmenting the senior housing and care market into property types, and NIC, through its volunteer leaders, led the initiative to define senior housing property types, including independent living, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing properties, and CCRCs. In 2004, after several years of effort, working in collaboration with the industry trade associations, the senior housing property type classifications were published. With definitions in hand, NIC volunteer leaders recruited data contributors to provide inventory, occupancy, and asking rates, which formed the basis for NIC MAP, or the NIC MAP Data Service, launched as a pilot in 2004, covering 31 major metropolitan markets. Efforts to develop the original NIC MAP data service were led by volunteer board members Ray Braun of Healthcare REIT, now Welltower, and Kathy Sweeney of AEW. Working together with Mr. Kramer, they recruited 25 initial founders who each committed to being subscribers to the data service for the first 2 years. Because of the success of and interest in the NIC MAP data service, NIC quickly expanded from 31 metro markets to 75 markets in 2006 and expanded further to the top 100 metro markets in 2008. In 2007, the first MAP local product was released. Though the organization had made significant progress by 2008 in bringing transparency to investors about seniors' housing and care through data, it still did not offer comparable transparency to that available in other commercial property types. In order to assess their progress to date and what still needed to be done, in 2008, NIC hired Professor Peter Linneman of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania to do a study comparing growth and transparency in the senior housing and care sector to that of the hospitality and multifamily sectors. Dr. Linneman presented the results of his assessment at the fall 2008 NIC conference. His comments provided the board and Mr. Kramer with a roadmap of tasks that still needed to be accomplished in their efforts to educate investors and provide them with needed data and analytics. One company that was active in senior housing early on was AEW. The leader of their senior housing platform, Kathy Sweeney, was an active board member and eventually board chair of NIC. In addition, AEW economist and market researcher Beth Mace contributed enormously to efforts to get senior housing and its performance recognized in the institutional real estate space. Thanks in large part to the efforts of Ms. Mace, in 2010, the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries, or NACREIF, began including senior housing along other property types, such as industrial, office, retail, multifamily, and hotel in its published equity investment performance data. And in 2010, under the leadership of Ray Braun and the work of NIC's new research director, Chuck Harry, NIC published the first edition of the Investment Guide for Seniors Housing and Care. This publication marked the beginning of NIC moving from just producing data to providing analytics for investors interested in the sector. In 2010, NIC also formed a strategic alliance with Real Capital Analytics, or RCA, in order to get better access to transactions data, as well as provide more comparability for investors in terms of data available for other commercial property types. In 2011, NIC MAP's portfolio product for asset management was released. And in 2011, NIC released the first sales transaction data and began collecting skilled nursing financial data metrics. By 2011, the top 3 healthcare REITs, all of whom had significant investments in senior housing and care, were among the top 10 largest U.S. REITs. In 2013, seniors housing was voted the most attractive property type amongst institutional investors for new investments, representing the culmination of nearly 20 years of work to gain recognition for this property type amongst institutional investors. Seniors housing was no longer a poorly known or niche property type. It had arrived on the radar of institutional investors. As senior housing products evolved and as demand continued to grow, interest in the industry increased. But there was still a need to analyze the data being collected and put it into context against the broader market, the economy at large, and other real estate property types. This led to the hiring of Beth Mace in 2014 as NIC's and the industry's first chief economist. This hire of Ms. Mace as chief economist underscored NIC's commitment to analytics. Ms. Mace was a former NIC board member and chair of the research committee and was well-versed in speaking about senior housing in the context of other economic trends. This helped grow NIC's brand and ability to develop narratives using NIC's data as NIC grew its research and analytics capabilities. In 2015, NIC reached a significant landmark with 10 years of market fundamentals data having been published for the top 31 metro markets. NIC also began data collection on actual rates in addition to asking rates. In 2016, NIC MAP expanded its coverage to 140 metropolitan markets in the U.S. and launched its NIC MAP 2.0 client portal. It also launched its skilled nursing data report and began reporting on actual rates and leasing activity. The following year, NIC added the Bureau of Labor, Employment, and Wage Report data to the NIC MAP dataset. In 2021, NIC MAP merged with Vision LTC to form NIC MAP Vision, or NMV, and the organization was spun out as a separate for-profit entity. NIC MAP data was important not just for participants in the senior housing and care industry, but also to provide context to new investors on industry performance over periods of time and during key economic events such as the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. NIC MAP's industry metrics provided investors with the data necessary to understand seniors housing and care performance relative to other real estate asset classes, and in particular, how it performed in times of stress in the broader economy, the housing market, and the capital markets. The research and analytics team at NIC puts industry data into context and conducts original research on key topics, often with noted research partners. In furtherance of its role as thought leader for the industry, NIC's research focuses attention on new challenges and opportunities for the senior housing and care sector. One such opportunity identified by NIC's research was the underserved market of middle-income older adults. In 2019, NIC coined the phrase "the forgotten middle" as part of a research study conducted for NIC by NORC at the University of Chicago. This study, published in Health Affairs, the leading health policy journal in the United States, was the 5th most read study in 2019 published in Health Affairs. It brought attention of both public policy makers and private sector investors, owners, operators, and developers to the huge untapped need and opportunity to serve those middle-class older adults who have insufficient resources to afford most private pay senior living, at least for very long, but too much in resources to qualify for government support, either in terms of long-term care or in terms of housing. This study brought national attention and focus to NIC and significantly broadened the constituency and the perceived value of the brand and reach of the organization. NIC followed up on its pioneering work in the middle market with numerous sessions at its conferences, a special invitation-only roundtable conducted prior to the spring 2023 conference, and 2 major new research initiatives. One was an effort jointly sponsored with CVS Health in partnership with the Milken Institute and their Financial Innovations Lab and the Center for the Future of Aging, to look at scalable models for both public and private sector funding of middle market senior housing that would provide not only housing, but also services and supports and wraparound preventative health and chronic disease management services. In addition, NIC partnered with the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University to sponsor the 2023 edition of their Housing for Older Americans report, with a special focus on the middle market. This report also included an affordability index for assisted living and home care for middle-income adults at the national and select metro market level. NIC also developed and funded an ongoing research agenda with NORC at the University of Chicago. First were a series of studies looking at the impact of COVID on senior living settings and amongst older adults in the general population. The results of these studies were published first in 2021 and further results in early 2023. One of the key developments in these studies was a new methodology that enabled cross-mapping at the 9-digit zip code level, the more than 17,000 senior housing and care properties in the NIC MAP Vision NMV database with the 9-digit Medicare claims data. This cross-mapping methodology provided an unprecedented opportunity to analyze such areas as the frailty level of residents in different types of senior housing and care, their access to healthcare providers, comparative health outcomes, comparative longevity, and a number of other key topics. As part of a 3-year research plan jointly developed by NIC and NORC at the University of Chicago. Volunteer leadership. One of the key drivers of NIC's growth and success through the years has been its volunteer leadership. To ensure continuity of volunteer leadership, NIC formed the Future Leaders Council, or FLC, in 2009. The purpose of the FLC was to identify rising talent, typically with less than 10 years experience in the industry, that could potentially serve on NIC's board at some point in the future. The FLC was designed to ensure it was a cross-section of different segments of the sector, from capital providers to operators to intermediaries facilitating transactions and key partners providing services to the industry. In return for leadership development in the FLC, FLC members help NIC deliver on its mission by pursuing various projects and initiatives. By the summer of 2023, 3 former FLC members were serving on the board and the executive committee of the organization. NIC conferences and training. NIC's fall conference for years was known as simply the NIC Conference or the NIC. After more than a dozen years of being held exclusively in Washington, D.C., the event began to be held in other locations, primarily Chicago. In the spring of 2007, NIC launched what was, at that time, called the Regional Conference. This annual spring event evolved over the years to focus increasingly on the role of and opportunity for integration of healthcare and healthcare services in senior housing and care, and the opportunity presented by the shift to value-based care. Attendance at the fall conference grew to more than 3,000 by 2019, and attendance at the spring conference grew to nearly 2,000 by 2023. In the fall of 2023, NIC debuted its Data and Analytics Conference to help industry professionals identify actionable ways to harness data to enhance their business offerings and services. In late 2023, NIC also launched NIC Academy, using industry veterans to provide education for professionals on critical subjects such as fundamentals of industry operations, transactions, and capital markets. NIC Academy was built on NIC's highly popular boot camps for professionals in seniors housing and skilled nursing, which were created by NIC's FLC, with new online courses and certificate programs. Staff leadership. In 2008, NIC engaged Bob Kramer to be its full-time president and CEO. In 2015, Brian Jarutka joined NIC as its president. In the summer of 2017, in a planned transition, Mr. Jarutka became president and CEO, and Mr. Kramer took on a new role as strategic advisor and board member. In 2022, Ray Braun, who had formerly served as a volunteer board member and board chair, came back to NIC after 10 years as a business school dean to serve as president and CEO. And in 2023, Beth Mace transitioned from her role as chief economist and director of outreach to become special advisor to the organization with a focus on reporting and evaluating trends in the capital markets. By 2020, it was clear that in furtherance of its mission to advance access and choice for older adults to senior housing and care, NIC had succeeded over the previous 30 years in accomplishing the objective of facilitating capital formation by increasing access to capital and reducing the cost of that capital for developers, owners, and operators. Seniors housing was now a recognized asset class and one of the major commercial property types. The challenge for the organization was to look to the future and identify what new objectives NIC should pursue in order to drive access and choice for older adults for the next 30 years. In 2022, the NIC Board of Directors, under the leadership of Board Chair Kurt Reed, adopted a new strategic plan designed to significantly broaden the tent of the constituency served by NIC by identifying new market opportunities and challenges and providing thought leadership and groundbreaking research. In particular, the plan laid out 5 focus areas, including partnering for health, serving the forgotten middle, engaging new customers and new products to serve the lifestyle-driven demands of older adults, exploring the transformative impact of age tech and data, including AI and business intelligence tools, and encouraging increased investment in operations and operating companies. This strategic plan developed at a critical inflection point in the industry, coming out of the COVID pandemic, a workforce crisis, and disruption in the capital markets, and preparing to serve the next generation of older adults, positioned NIC to guide the industry through challenging times and lead the evolution of senior housing and care.